The town in the southern part of Georgia lived a quiet and measured life. In the evenings, as the sun slowly set behind the dense trees, the air was saturated with the smell of wet grass and sweet jasmine. The Brown family was one of those pillars of local society, respectable, prosperous, seemingly devoid of any serious problems. Harper Brown was Caleb's second wife, slightly younger than him but mature enough to remain the epitome of elegance and confidence. She was a tall woman with perfect posture and thick black hair that was always styled in a style that emphasized her features. There was an occasional flicker of melancholy in her eyes that not everyone could see, but those who were closer could see that something in her life was keeping her down. Caleb Brown, her husband, was a successful businessman who owned several shops in the center of town, and people came to him for advice as an older, wiser friend. Business wasn't the only thing occupying his thoughts, however. Caleb had a grown daughter from his first marriage, Monica, who had married George Wilson only a year before. This marriage was a big event for the local community. The young couple seemed as happy as a picture. Monica, resembling her father with her proud posture and confident look, filled the house with laughter and warmth. And George, her husband, a young, ambitious lawyer, was always attentive and gallant. He was the kind of man who in every situation held himself calm and dignified, as if nothing could throw him off balance. For Monica, marriage to George was the fulfillment of a dream. Growing up, her relationship with her father was far from ideal, especially after her mother's death, but the arrival of Harper in her life made things a lot easier. Although their relationship had never been close, Harper did her best to create a semblance of normalcy. They didn't fight, but they didn't seek each other out for heart-to-heart conversations either. Monica always felt like a stranger around her stepmother, perhaps a consequence of Harper stepping into her late mother's shoes, leaving an indelible imprint on the family relationship. It would seem that the family idyll was found, but not everything was so simple. Deep down, Harper had long felt disappointment. Her marriage to Caleb was not what she had expected. Although they had been together for years, he continued to live his life of affairs and business meetings with little or no attention to her. Their shared moments were reduced to brief conversations in the mornings over breakfast, and rare weekends when Caleb wasn't immersed in work. Harper, accustomed to more attention, began to feel unwanted and alone within these walls. Monica, on the other hand, seemed oblivious to Harper's estrangement. Her relationship with her father was not close, and her stepmother seemed cold and distant. Monica accepted this as inevitable and focused on her new status as a wife and her family life with George. Her day was filled with taking care of the house, meeting friends, and participating in charity events that were important to maintaining her image in the community. George was the complete opposite of her. Quiet and centered, he never put himself on display, but always knew how to support Monica and be there for her when she demanded it. Their marriage was built on balance, an outwardly perfect harmony. But even in a seemingly perfect relationship, there are always subtle cracks that are not immediately noticeable. One such crack was the occasional glances exchanged between Harper and George. In the beginning, they were only rare encounters at family dinners or holidays when their eyes crossed. Their gazes lingered for a moment longer than politeness demanded. Harper noticed George looking at her, sometimes too intently, and though she tried to ignore it, something inside made her respond to those glances. It had started out as an innocent game. One day at a family dinner, when Caleb and Monica were engrossed in a conversation about new plans for the business, Harper and George found themselves on opposite ends of the table. Her eyes slid over to him, and she noticed his gaze stopped on her face. Their eyes met, and instead of looking away as they had before, they held each other's gaze a little longer than would have been decent. George smiled slightly, and Harper, without realizing it herself, returned the favor. Ow. It was the only disruption to the normal course of things that evening. But with each day that followed, their glances became more and more explicit. Encounters that had seemed casual were no longer so. Seemingly small things, a delayed glance, a slight smile, or a fleeting gesture, began to bind them together by an invisible thread. Harper secretly savored these moments. Her life with Caleb was predictable and boring. She often wondered what it would be like to feel again the passion that had long since faded in her marriage. And George, A young, handsome, confident man was exactly what she was attracted to. For George, however, it was more complicated. He loved Monica, or at least he was sure he loved her, but there was something about Harper that gripped him. She was a woman who saw him as more than just a successful lawyer or a caring husband. She saw him as a man, which was flattering to him. Over time, their interactions began to take on new nuances. They began to cross paths in private more often. Sometimes it was chance encounters on the street when Harper was returning from shopping, or quiet moments when Monica was away on business. These moments were filled with a hidden intrigue that they both tried not to notice, but which they found hard to give up. Harper was playing with fire, but did she realize how far it could go? Perhaps a part of her soul longed for something new, something she'd sorely missed in her marriage to Caleb. Her disappointment had been the breeding ground for those forbidden emotions, and now every glance from George only made her desire stronger. Harper wasn't one to rush headlong into it, however. She recognized the danger of her situation and tried to keep control of the situation. There was nothing untoward in her relationship with George, but there was a tension in the air that could turn disastrous at any moment. George realized, too, that this was playing with fire. He wasn't inclined to cheat, but he felt himself drawn more and more to Harper. Her mystery, inner loneliness, and maturity drew him in. He knew he was drawn to a woman who wasn't his wife, and the thought began to torment him. But each day it became harder and harder to resist. Meanwhile, Monica didn't notice anything. She continued to enjoy her life, planning her future with George, and rejoicing that their marriage was thriving. Her worries seemed trivial compared to what she considered true marital happiness. But happiness is notoriously fragile. The relationship between George and Harper developed gradually, like a barely perceptible fire that soon grew into an uncontrollable blaze. Each new encounter, each passing touch or glance added fuel to that fire, and soon their connection was no longer just a collection of random moments. Deep down, George realized that he was going too far, but with each meeting his resistance weakened, and his attraction to Harper grew stronger. It started when their meetings became more frequent and more meaningful. One day, as George was walking home from work, he happened to meet Harper at the supermarket. Their eyes met, they exchanged a brief smile, and Harper invited him to have coffee at a small cafe on the corner. The proposal sounded like something ordinary, but also like something more, hidden behind the veil of everyday life. George agreed, though he felt it was more than just a friendly encounter. They sat at a table by the window, chatting about insignificant things, but there was something much more powerful and dangerous in the air. It was obvious that they were drawn to each other, even if they tried not to notice it yet. Harper was especially pretty that day. Her dark hair was gathered into a neat bun, and her face had that enigmatic smile that George found irresistible. She spoke quietly, but her voice was beckoning, as if lulling. George could hardly keep from touching her hand as she lifted the cup of coffee. The gesture seemed so natural that he had to make an effort not to give in to the impulse. Over the following weeks, these encounters began to happen more frequently. They were no longer mere coincidences. It was as if their paths had deliberately crossed at the store, or on the street, or at the Browns' house. Each such encounter carried something new, profound, almost unbearable. Gradually, George and Harper stopped ignoring their attraction to each other. The evenings when they were alone in the kitchen of the Browns' house became longer and more intense. Every conversation they had was permeated with hidden hints. Every gesture seemed full of meaning. One day, Harper lingered longer than usual outside the house when George was about to leave. They stood on the veranda, no longer hiding what was going on between them. A light breeze fluttered her hair, and he couldn't take his eyes off her face. At one point, Harper took a step closer and lightly touched his arm. The gesture was so simple, but its meaning felt as if it were electrified. George could resist no longer. "This is wrong," he thought as her fingers slid down his arm. But it was that forbiddenness that made everything so tantalizing. He knew he should stop, that at any moment this could go too far, but his attraction to Harper had become almost a physical necessity for him. Their affair began to develop rapidly. More and more often they secluded themselves in quiet places where no one could see them. Sometimes Harper would come to his office late at night when her husband and Monica were already asleep. Sometimes they met in a small park outside of town where the locals didn't often go. Their secret meetings became more and more intense. Every minute alone together fueled a fire between them that was impossible to extinguish. Harper was reserved, but it was her calmness and cold confidence that made her so desirable to George. He felt beside her in a way he had never felt with Monica. There was something about Harper, something mature and wise, that attracted him far more than the youthful ease of his wife. She was something unknown to him, dangerous, and it frightened him but also attracted him. George, who had previously been certain of his love for Monica, began to doubt. Now, as he looked at his wife, his thoughts involuntarily returned to Harper. He began to notice little things he hadn't noticed before. The way Monica talked, the way she laughed, the way she hugged him, and it all seemed ordinary, tasteless to him. He began to compare her to Harper, and the comparison was not in Monica's favor. Each encounter with Harper emphasized how much he now desired her and how little he was attracted to his own wife. These doubts began to poison his mind. He became more and more infatuated with Harper and less aware of his connection to Monica. Their life together, which had seemed so perfect to him at first, now seemed empty and meaningless. George could no longer return the feelings he once had for Monica. Their conversations had become formal, their touch mechanical. He began to avoid intimacy with her, finding excuses not to spend evenings at home. Monica, naive and in love, did not notice her husband's estrangement. She still believed their marriage was strong and happy. Harper, on the other hand, saw everything. Her sharp mind allowed her to anticipate George's moves, his thoughts and emotions. She knew George was struggling with himself, but that struggle only increased her power over him. She didn't give him ready answers, didn't push him into action, but only watched his desire grow stronger and stronger. For Harper, this game wasn't just a passion, it was an opportunity to feel power over her life, an opportunity to take what she had long lacked in her relationship with Caleb. And so, one evening, when they were alone again, George couldn't take it anymore. They met at a small lake house owned by the Brown family. The place was quiet, away from the hustle and bustle of the city. Harper had invited him over ostensibly to discuss family matters, but both knew it was just an excuse. When they entered the house and closed the door behind them, the atmosphere immediately changed. Silence filled the space, and tension built between them that they could no longer ignore. George stepped closer to Harper, his breathing quickening. Her eyes were full of anticipation, but she made no move to approach him first. This was her game, and she knew he would make the first move. George leaned toward her. Their faces were within breathing distance. He froze for a moment, as if doubting for the last time whether he should cross that line. But then his hands touched her waist and he pulled her to him. In that moment, everything became inevitable. Their lips met, and the world around them ceased to exist. The kiss was long, intense, as if they were trying to make up for all the time they had spent thinking and doubting. Harper answered him with a passion he hadn't expected. Her arms wrapped around his neck and her body pressed against him with adamancy. That moment was the point of no return. Their connection was now real, and they both realized there was no turning back. Each day their encounters became more frequent and more passionate. George could no longer resist. He sought out meetings with Harper, finding any excuse to be near her. Each new encounter brought more pleasure and more pain, because he knew it all had to be kept secret. But something inside George told him that this affair could not last forever. The passion between them was too strong, too intense to go unnoticed. With each passing day, a sense of unease grew, a premonition of trouble. George and Harper's affair grew like an avalanche, inevitably taking everything in its path with it. Their passion became more and more unbridled, their meetings more frequent and dangerous. They lived in their own world, detached from reality, ignoring what was happening around them. But reality, as always, found a way to remind them of themselves in the most brutal way. Monica didn't notice anything until a certain point. She still believed in the ideal of her marriage to George, although his aloofness and coldness gradually began to worry her. Her happy morning conversations with her husband became shorter, and increasingly George avoided her embrace or found reasons not to be alone with her. Monica tried to ignore the changes, reassuring herself that they were only temporary difficulties due to his work and responsibilities. One evening, however, changed everything. It was the day George met up with Harper again at their secret location. They spent several hours together discussing how to be more careful about hiding their affair and how to proceed. Returning home, George didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. But when he entered the house, Monica met him on the doorstep. Her face was pale, and her eyes full of pain and rage. "George," she began quietly, but with an obvious tremor in her voice, "where have you been? I know you've been lying to me for a long time. What's going on?" George froze. His heart beat faster and 1,000 thoughts raced through his head. She recognized something, guessed something, but to what extent? He wasn't ready to admit it yet, so he decided to wait it out. "I was in a meeting for work, Monica. I told you I'd have a lot to do," he replied, trying to look calm. But Monica wasn't listening to him anymore. Her eyes looked at him with a look of disbelief that he couldn't ignore. "Enough lies, George." Her voice became firmer. "Do you think I'm blind? You think I don't notice anything? You and Harper?" She was silent, trying to hold back the tears, but the bitterness and resentment had already broken through. "You see each other behind my back. Do you think I haven't noticed how cold you've become to me? How you've disappeared more and more?" Her words were like a blow. George couldn't find the words to justify himself, though he was seething inside. He knew they had both gone too far, and now everything was falling apart. Monica, once so naive and trusting, had suddenly turned into a woman who saw the truth. "It's not what you think," he tried to justify himself, but his voice betrayed him. There was uncertainty in his tone, and Monica noticed it. "Oh no, it's exactly what I think." Monica took a step toward him, her eyes glistening with tears and anger. "You're cheating on me with my stepmother, with a woman who was part of our family. How could you?" George realized there was no point in denying anymore. He wanted to find the words to explain, but instead he stood silent, feeling his world crumble. Monica continued to speak, her voice trembling but each word as sharp as a knife. "I trusted you, George. You were my husband, my companion. And what? You betrayed me with the woman who stands in the same house as us. How could I not have seen that before?" With every word Monica said, George felt fear overwhelm him. He realized that their secret was no longer a secret, and the worst part was that now it could all come out. It wasn't something that could be negotiated. It was something that had already destroyed their marriage. Monica was devastated. She couldn't believe that George, the man she had bound her life to, had betrayed her so cruelly. Thoughts raced through her mind about what to do next. Divorce? A scandal? Her world, which had seemed so stable, was falling apart right before her eyes. That night, Monica retired to her room, locked herself in, and never said another word. George stayed in the living room, staring into the void, not knowing what to do next. He knew their relationship was over, but he didn't understand how to break the vicious cycle. The next day, Monica acted cold, but outwardly still reserved. She didn't take it out in public, but in her eyes she could read a deep resentment. She began to avoid George, didn't answer his questions, and distanced herself from him completely. Meanwhile, Harper knew nothing about their secret being out. She was still seeing George, and although she realized that their liaison was becoming increasingly risky, she couldn't stop. But the atmosphere between them had changed. George had become nervous, less open. He was no longer the man who gave himself carelessly to passion. A few days after that quarrel, everything changed for good. One evening when George returned home from work, he noticed that the house was unusually quiet. Usually Monica, even if she was avoiding him, left the light on in the living room or turned on music. But this evening it was different. He sensed something wrong, but he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. He walked through the living room and up the second floor to the bedroom. The door was ajar. George pushed it open and froze on the threshold. The scene before him was like being plucked from a nightmare. Monica was lying on the bed, her face contorted with horror and her body mutilated. Blood soaked the sheets and dripped onto the floor. Her neck was lacerated and her arms were clenched tightly, as if she had tried to defend herself at the last moment. But there was no struggle. The killer was too hard and too fast. George was stunned. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. He knew that their relationship with Monica was far from ideal, that they were no longer close, but something like this. He fell to his knees beside the bed, feeling the world fall apart around him. Monica was dead, and there was nothing he could do to change that. After a few minutes, George was still able to call the police. The officers who arrived on the scene froze on the doorstep of the bedroom after seeing the atrocity the young woman had been subjected to. One of the first to arrive on the scene was Detective Leroy Reed, known in the city for his investigative successes. He was a taciturn but focused man whose methods often seemed unfamiliar to the rest of us, but always yielded results. Inspecting the crime scene, Detective Reed noticed many details that didn't fit together. The murder was brutal, as if someone with a strong personal hatred was behind it. But there were no signs of forced entry, the door had not been ripped off, the windows were closed, and the house was locked. Everything indicated that Monica knew her killer and had let him in on her own. Meanwhile, George became the prime suspect. His presence in the house at the time of the murder, his changed behavior and previous conflicts with his wife made him a convenient target for suspicion. But George was shocked by what had happened, and his genuine horror made the police think twice. However, the police had no real lead. Harper, on hearing what had happened, was stunned. Her face grew even paler and fear settled in her eyes. Now her and George's secret liaison could be revealed. The murder scene was shrouded in silence, broken only by the occasional police conversation. Detective Leroy Reed, a tall, stout man with a keen eye, walked confidently through the house, inspecting every corner. His appearance was deceptive. Beneath the seeming impenetrability was a sharp mind, capable of detecting the smallest details that eluded others. His reputation was impeccable. Leroy was renowned for his success in solving complex crimes, and this murder of Monica immediately caused him a kind of premonition. Something about this story wasn't right, and Leroy knew there were ulterior motives here that would have to be uncovered. When Leroy entered the bedroom, there was still a sense of tension in the air. Monica's body had already been taken away, but the traces of her last moments were still there. Scattered belongings, bloodstains on the sheets and floor. The picture could not be called accidental. The killer had acted with obvious rage. It could not be just the work of a cold-blooded professional. Leroy scrutinized the space, noting that there were no signs of forced entry. Everything indicated that Monica knew the killer. He inched forward, scrutinizing the edges of the doorframe, and drew his first conclusion. Whoever had killed her must have made himself at home here. Leroy straightened, slowly turning to the officer who had arrived first on the scene. "Who in the family was home at the time of the murder?" he asked without raising his voice, but the officer immediately felt the detective's words sink in, pressurizing him. "George Wilson, her husband." "He's the one who called the police," the officer replied, slightly nervously. "He was in the house when it happened." Leroy nodded. His suspicions, as usual, began to form slowly, step by step. The husband is the default prime suspect in any case like this, but something told Leroy that things might be more complicated here. All that remained was to figure out exactly how. The first person the detective decided to question was George himself. He was sitting in the living room, staring at a single point on the floor. His face was pale, and his hands were shaking, as if he himself did not fully realize what had happened. When Leroy entered the room, George looked up, and the detective immediately noted the nervousness in his gaze. It could be explained by the shock of his wife's death, but Leroy knew what ordinary grief looked like, and what something more than that looked like. "Mr. Wilson," Leroy began, taking a seat across from him. "I realize this is a difficult time for you, but we need to discuss what happened. It will help us understand what happened." George nodded, but his gaze remained tense. "Yeah, I don't know what to say," he said. His voice was hoarse, as if there was a lump in his throat. "I came home and found her. She was already dead." Leroy paused, watching George's every move. "Where were you before you came home?" he asked calmly. George looked away. "At work. I was in a meeting and then I went to a bar, just for a drink. Yeah, I needed a distraction. Monica and I were having difficulties." His voice trembled, and Leroy picked up on it immediately. It was a hint of hidden conflict. Difficulties? Leroy clarified. George hesitated but continued. We haven't been getting along lately. She's become cold, distant. I tried, but something had changed. Leroy noted this but didn't show the slightest interest on his face. You say you were at the bar, can you confirm that? Maybe someone saw you there? George froze, as if trying to remember something. Yeah, the bartender must have seen me. I wasn't there long. Leroy nodded, making a mental note to check George's alibi. It sounded convincing so far, but something about his behavior was bothering the detective. It was as if he wasn't telling him the truth. With George's interrogation complete, Leroy headed to the next important witness, Harper. Monica's stepmother, who had behaved with extreme restraint since the beginning of the investigation, evoked contradictory feelings in the detective. Her face remained calm, but Leroy caught something in her eyes that did not allow him to remain indifferent. Harper looked too cold-blooded for a woman who had just lost her stepdaughter. Mrs. Harper? Leroy began, sitting down across from her in the small library where she had been asked to wait. Were you in the house at the time of the murder? Harper shook her head. No, I was at the beauty parlor. I had just come back when I heard the news. It's awful. I can't believe this could have happened to Monica. Her voice sounded sincere, but Leroy noticed a subtle shadow of doubt on her face. She was clearly concerned about something else, and this concern went beyond the usual shock. What was your relationship with Monica like? He asked directly, deciding not to waste time on foreplay. Harper smiled slightly, but it was a strange, strained smile. Monica and I weren't close, she admitted, but we maintained a polite relationship. I tried to stay out of her life and her marriage. Leroy noticed Harper avoiding her gaze. She was clearly hiding something, but what? The detective decided not to press her immediately, expecting her defenses to weaken later. And where was your husband at the time of the murder? Leroy continued. Caleb? He was at work, as always, Harper answered quickly. He couldn't have done anything like that. Leroy sensed that Harper was too quick to start defending her husband, another hint of an underlying dynamic in this family. For the next few days, Leroy focused on checking the alibis of everyone in the family. Caleb was indeed at work, and his whereabouts were confirmed by co-workers. George was seen at the bar, but the bartender couldn't confirm the exact time he left. Harper also provided several witnesses from the beauty parlor, but Leroy remained suspicious. Something about the woman continued to bother him. Slowly but surely, Leroy began to realize that Monica's murder was just the tip of the iceberg. Beneath the surface of the family relationship lurked old resentments and secret passions that were now beginning to surface. He talked to neighbors, colleagues, family acquaintances, trying to piece together a picture of the relationship. He was particularly alarmed by George's behavior. Every time the detective asked him questions, George became more and more nervous, his answers less and less confident. Perhaps he was in shock at the loss of his wife, but Leroy suspected it was more than that. He knew that George was hiding something, and that something might have something to do with Harper. Leroy began checking phone calls and messages exchanged between family members. He managed to get George's phone records, and here he found what he was looking for: frequent calls and messages between George and Harper in recent months. They were clearly communicating far more frequently than one would expect from a normal sibling relationship. This information further solidified his suspicions. Leroy felt that Harper was not just a stepmother standing on the sidelines, but an active participant in this complex triangle. However, the evidence was too weak to draw definitive conclusions. He soon learned of an old family friend who had long been out of touch with the Wilsons, but had once been close to Monica. This man probably knew more about the family's past than everyone else. Leroy set out to find him to find out what other secrets lurked behind the facade of this seemingly ordinary family. Detective Leroy Reed sat at the desk in his office, mulling over the latest leads. Monica, Harper, and George's family ties were more complicated than he had expected. Monica's murder had been carefully planned, but the motives remained hidden beneath a layer of deceit, jealousy, and long-standing resentments. He'd spent hours studying records, interviewing witnesses, and checking alibis. Everything pointed to George being involved, but something didn't add up. If he wanted to get rid of his wife, he wouldn't have done it in such a brutal and showy manner. Leroy knew he had to dig deeper, and it was finally time to get everyone together. The evening was cool, The dim light of the bulbs in the Wilson house gave the place an ominous tinge. Leroy had invited George, Harper, and Caleb to a meeting to try to untangle the final knots of this tangled story. Harper was as calm as ever. Her face retained the same mask of equanimity that had haunted Leroy since the first day of the investigation. George, on the other hand, looked even more confused and tense. His nervous movements betrayed an inner fear, as if he were about to break under the pressure. Caleb sat slightly off to the side, immersed in his own thoughts, as if what was happening to him didn't concern him. Leroy began slowly, as if intentionally stretching the conversation to make each of them show their true emotions. For the past few weeks, I've been trying to figure out what happened in the house the day Monica died, Leroy said, his voice calm but tense. We've determined that Monica was killed in a brutal and ruthless manner, and while many of the facts pointed to George, I wasn't sure it was that simple. He paused, looking at each of the people gathered. Harper smiled slightly with the edges of her lips, as if anticipating something. I checked the surveillance tapes around your house, Leroy continued. They showed that George had indeed gone to the bar on the day of the murder, just as he'd said. However, it was much earlier than he claimed. Which means that you, Mr. Wilson, had plenty of time to get home before the police were called. George looked up sharply, his face contorted with horror. I didn't kill her, he exclaimed, jumping up from his seat. I couldn't. I loved Monica. Leroy remained unperturbed, but his eyes were fixed on Harper, who was looking at George with a cold, almost indifferent smile. Loved, Leroy stretched out, but that didn't stop you from having an affair with Harper. The words hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Caleb, who'd been sitting off to the side, suddenly perked up, his eyes darting a glance in Harper's direction. She, however, did not move, her face a mask of equanimity. You know nothing, George blurted out, his voice trembling with excitement. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I know more than you think, replied Leroy. I know that your affair with Harper started months ago. I know that Monica found out about it and wanted to file for divorce. But you, George, aren't the only one hiding something here. George froze, unable to understand where the detective was going with this. Leroy turned his gaze to Harper. Tell me, Mrs. Harper, how long did you plan to get rid of your stepdaughter? Leroy asked. There was dead silence. Harper's face changed slightly for the first time in ages. Her eyes flashed for a moment, but she quickly pulled herself together. What are you talking about, detective? She said with an icy calmness. You knew Monica would be a threat to your marriage when you found out about the affair with George. Leroy began, his voice growing more confident. She could ruin your life, leave you with nothing, and you realized that the only way to save everything was to get rid of her. You used George as a tool. You pushed him into the affair to distract him, and then cleverly directed his actions in the direction you wanted. That's nonsense, Harper replied coldly, but a shadow of alarm flickered in her voice. You knew George loved Monica, and he couldn't have killed her, continued Leroy, ignoring her words. So you took matters into your own hands. You knew George would be too scared to tell the truth. You made him think he was to blame for what happened. He became your perfect cover. George stood stiffly, his face pale. He was beginning to realize that he was a pawn in Harper's complex game. That's not true, he shouted, as if trying to convince himself. Harper rose from her chair, her face tense as if she were trying to hold back a burst of anger. Do you really think I could do such a thing? She said, trying to keep control of herself. It's ridiculous. Leroy kept his eyes on her. I think you're capable of much more than that, Mrs. Harper. You had access to everything in this house. You knew when George was in the bar, and you could act without witnesses. You killed Monica, and then went back to your normal life, thinking no one would guess. Harper took a step forward, her eyes narrowing. What about motive, detective? Why would I kill her? Her voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent of defiance in it. To protect yourself, Leroy answered. To get rid of the threat and save your marriage. You may have even convinced yourself that you were doing it for Caleb. But the truth is, you did it for yourself. At that moment, several police officers entered the room, waiting outside the door at Leroy's command. Harper froze, her eyes darting around, and for a moment it looked like she was about to rush out. But then her face regained the icy calm with which she had met every question from Leroy. George, she said quietly, turning to the man who stood a few feet away from her. "You're not going to let them do this, are you?" George looked at her with terror in his eyes. He finally realized that he had been nothing but a puppet in Harper's hands all these months. All his feelings, everything he thought was real, had turned out to be part of her elaborate game. "Yeah, I can't," he whispered, lowering his head. You used me." Harper took one last step forward, and the officers immediately came up behind her, cuffing her wrists. She didn't resist, only grinned as the officers led her toward the exit. "You'll never understand, Detective," she said as she said goodbye. "I did what I had to do." Leroy gave her a look, then turned to George. The man sat on the edge of the chair, as if lost in his world. His life had crumbled in a single day, and he couldn't believe he'd been part of such a terrible conspiracy. "You were a pawn, George," Leroy said quietly, sitting down beside him. "But you didn't kill Monica. It was Harper. She used you because she knew you couldn't resist her charms, but it wasn't your fault." George nodded, but there was still regret in his eyes. He lowered his head, and Leroy realized that it would be hard to absolve this man of guilt for what had happened. Detective Leroy Reed realized that the truth didn't always bring relief, and sometimes only made the pain worse. Monica was dead, and no amount of justice could bring her back to life. Harper, despite her calm and coolness, would now find herself behind bars, but how much destruction had she already left in her wake? George was trapped in a trap created by his own weaknesses and the manipulations of others. "George," Leroy put a hand on his shoulder, "I realize this is hard, but you have to remember that you didn't kill your wife. You will have to live through this pain so that you can one day find your way back to yourself." George looked up slowly, tears streaming down his cheeks. He nodded, though his whole being said he still wasn't sure. Leroy knew he would have a lot of work ahead of him with this man to help him through this tragedy. But what was more important now was that the truth was revealed and the killer would be punished. The next day, once Harper was in custody, Detective Leroy Reed made a final report on the case. All indications were that Harper had acted methodically, planning the murder with cold precision. Her motives lurked not only in jealousy, but also in fear of losing control of the situation. For her, the affair with George was just a means to gain power and get rid of the threat of Monica. The crime, though brutal, was part of a larger scheme, a game that Harper had drawn everyone around her into. But her plans crumbled the moment Leroy began to notice the small inconsistencies that would eventually lead him to the clue. Family secrets, manipulation, and jealousy all became the starting point of the tragedy that ruined Monica. But even after Harper's arrest, there was still a sense of incompleteness in the air. George was broken, Caleb was in shock at his wife's actions, and Leroy himself, despite solving the case, felt no joy. He knew that cases like this always left scars, and this time the scar was especially deep. Several weeks passed. George slowly began to recover, even though his life had been shattered to the core. He still felt guilty for not seeing Harper's true colors and allowing himself to be manipulated by her. Caleb, on the other hand, decided to leave town to try to start his life over. His marriage to Harper was broken, and the memory of Monica had become unbearable for him. Leroy watched as life around him slowly returned to normal, but he knew that nothing would ever be the same again for those involved. He sat in his office, reviewing the latest reports. The cases were many, but thoughts of the investigation never left him. Harper had been brought to trial and now awaited her long-awaited punishment. Her cold confidence and manipulation couldn't save her from justice. Leroy closed the case file and leaned back in his chair. Every case he investigated left its mark, but this one was special. He knew this case would be one that would haunt him for a long time to come. The truth was grim, and the price for it was too high. However, the truth had been established.